The great hall of Blackmore Castle shook with laughter and drums, but none of it reached the eyes of the man seated on the high stone throne. King Ronan Ashgard, ruler of the northern Pax, watched the feast below him, with the same cold patience he gave to everything else in his life. Fires roared in every corner. Wine spilled across long wooden tables. Nobles shouted toasts to his victories, his strength, his unmatched power. Not one person in that hall knew him. Not one person had ever tried. Ronan's hand tightened around the arm of his throne. Something felt wrong tonight, though he could not name it. He had won another border war 3 days ago, crushing a rival pack that dared test his lands. His generals called it a triumph. To him, it had felt like breathing. Nothing more. A commotion broke out near the musician's platform. The court's chosen singer, a man named Aldrich who had performed for the king since childhood, had collapsed from too much wine, and could not stand, let alone sing. The steward in charge of the feast, a nervous man named Corin, ran through the kitchens in a panic, searching for anyone who could fill the silence before the king noticed. That was when he found her. Elara Voss knelt near the hearth, scrubbing soot from an iron pot, her dark hair tied back with a strip of cloth, her hands raw from work. She was 19, an orphan taken in by the castle kitchens years ago after her village was destroyed in a raid she never spoke about. She kept her head down, did her work, and asked for nothing. Nobody in the castle truly saw her, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Corin grabbed her shoulder, breathless. You sing sometimes, don't you? I've heard you, late at night, when you think no one listens." Elara's stomach dropped. "I don't perform, sir. I only hum to pass the time. There is no time to argue. The king is waiting. If nothing fills that stage in the next few minutes, it will be my head, not yours." His voice cracked with real fear. She looked at her soot-covered hands, then at the doorway leading to the blazing hall beyond. Every instinct told her to refuse, to disappear into the shadows where she belonged. But Corin had always been kind to her, sneaking her extra bread on cold nights, and she could not let him suffer for her fear. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward the fire and noise she had spent her whole life avoiding. The hall swallowed her whole. Torches burned along every wall. Long tables stretched from one end to the other, crowded with warriors, nobles, and pack leaders from every corner of Ronan's territory. The air smelled of roasted meat, spiced wine, and burning wood. Laughter rolled like thunder, and no one noticed the small servant girl stepping onto the platform where the musicians usually stood. Elara's knees trembled. She had never stood before so many eyes. She glanced toward the throne at the far end of the hall and saw him for the first time up close. King Ronan Ashgard, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, his expression carved from stone. He was not looking at her. He was staring at nothing, the way a man stares when his mind is somewhere far darker than the room around him. Someone shoved a small string instrument into her hands, an old lute that had been sitting untouched near the platform. She had never played one before, but her fingers remembered the shape from years of watching the castle musicians during quiet afternoons. She placed her fingers where she thought they belonged and took a breath. The room did not quiet. Nobody expected anything from her. She was invisible, a servant standing where a real performer should be, and the noise continued without pause. Then she began to sing. Her voice came out soft at first, barely audible over the roar of the crowd, singing an old song her mother used to hum while they gathered water near their village stream, long before that village burned to ash. The melody was simple, built from grief and memory rather than skill, but there was something raw in it, something true. The first table to fall silent was nearest the platform. A group of warriors, mid-laugh, stopped and turned. Their silence spread like water soaking into dry cloth, table by table, until the great hall of Blackmore, filled with hundreds of loud and powerful people, became still enough to hear a single voice rising into the rafters. Elara's eyes stayed closed. She did not see the shock spreading across the room. She did not see nobles setting down their cups mid-drink, or warriors lowering their heads, moved by something they could not explain. She only felt the song, the way it pulled old pain up from her chest and let it float free for the first time in years. When she finally opened her eyes, the silence struck her harder than any noise ever could. Every face in that hall was turned toward her. Some looked stunned, some looked as though they might weep. And at the far end of the room, King Ronan Ashgard sat frozen on his throne, his cold expression cracked wide open, his eyes locked on her as if she were the only person left in the world. She lowered the lute, unsure what to do with the silence she had created. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, the applause began, rising until it shook the stone walls, warriors pounding their fists on tables, nobles rising to their feet. Elara felt her face burn with embarrassment and something else, a strange lightness she had never known before. But it was the king's silence that frightened her most. He did not clap. He did not smile. He simply stared, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the arms of his throne as though holding himself in place. Corin rushed to her side the moment she stepped off the platform, pulling her by the arm toward the kitchen exit. Go, quickly, before he calls for you. Before anyone remembers your face. Why would that matter? Elara asked, her heart still pounding from the performance. Corin's expression was grim. Because attention from the king is never simple, girl. Sometimes it is a gift, sometimes it is a curse. Go now, while you still can. She obeyed, slipping through the narrow servant halls back toward the kitchens, her hands trembling around the loot she still carried. She told herself the moment was over, that she would return to scrubbing pots and stay hidden as she always had. She did not know that behind her, in the great hall, the king had risen from his throne for the first time all evening, his eyes fixed on the door through which she had disappeared. Ronan's advisor, a sharp-eyed man named Garrick who had served 3 generations of Ashgard kings, leaned close to him. My lord, shall I fetch the entertainer? Perhaps she should perform again, for the closing toast. Ronan did not answer immediately. His mind replayed the sound of her voice, the way it had reached into his chest and pulled something loose that had been buried since he was a child. He had heard countless singers in his life, trained musicians brought from distant courts to entertain him, and none of them had ever made him feel anything at all. This servant girl, untrained and trembling, had undone him with a single song. Find out who she is, Ronan said finally, his voice low. Garrick raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. He had served this king long enough to know when a command was not meant to be questioned. Back in the kitchens, Elara returned the loot to its resting place and knelt again beside her abandoned pot, trying to steady her breathing. The other kitchen workers stared at her with wide eyes. That was you, whispered a young boy named Ren, who helped haul firewood. That was really you singing? It was nothing, Elara said quickly. A mistake. It won't happen again. But her hands would not stop shaking, and deep in her chest, something had shifted. For years she had swallowed her voice, kept it locked away, along with the memories of her burning village and the family she had lost. Tonight, for one fragile moment, she had let it out, and the world had actually listened. She did not know yet that the feast had changed everything. She did not know that somewhere above her, in the halls of power she had never been allowed to enter, a king who had never wept, never laughed freely, never once felt moved by another human being, had just discovered something he could not ignore. The feast continued for another hour, though the warmth in the room never fully returned. Guests spoke in quieter voices, still shaken by what they had witnessed. Ronan barely touched his wine. When the last guests finally stumbled toward their chambers and the fires began to die down, he remained seated on his throne long after the hall had emptied, staring at the spot where she had stood. Garrick returned near midnight, his boots echoing against the stone floor. My lord, I have the information you requested. Ronan's gaze sharpened. Speak. Her name is Elara Voss, a kitchen servant, orphaned as a child. She has worked in the castle for nearly 6 years. Quiet, obedient, unremarkable by every account until tonight. No family, no notable connections, no reason for anyone to have ever noticed her. And yet, Ronan said quietly, almost to himself, she silenced an entire feast. Garrick studied his king carefully, noting the strange light in his eyes, something he had never seen there before. Shall I bring her to you, my lord? Ronan was silent for a long moment, staring at the cold hearth, the dying embers, the empty platform where her voice had first reached him. Part of him wanted to dismiss the entire matter, to return to the cold discipline that had defined his life since childhood, when his father taught him that emotion was a weakness no true ruler could afford. A king did not chase servant girls because of a song. A king did not lose sleep over a moment of unexpected beauty in an otherwise ordinary night. But another part of him, a part buried so deep he had almost forgotten it existed, refused to let the memory go. Not tonight, Ronan said finally. Let her rest, but make sure she is not moved from the castle, and make sure no harm comes to her. Garrick bowed, though confusion flickered across his face. In all his years serving the Ashgard bloodline, he had never heard his king give an order to protect a servant, let alone one he had spoken to only through a single unexpected song. As Garrick left the hall, Ronan remained behind, alone with the dying fire and the strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest. He pressed his palm against his sternum, half expecting to find some physical wound there, some explanation for the feeling clawing its way through him. There was nothing, only the echo of her voice, still ringing faintly in his memory, refusing to fade. For the first time since he could remember, King Ronan Ashgard did not want silence. He wanted to hear that voice again. Elsewhere in the castle, deep within the servant quarters, Ilara lay awake on her narrow cot, staring at the cracked stone ceiling above her. Sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the sea of faces turned toward her, the shocked silence, the way the king had stared at her as though she had reached inside him and touched something he kept hidden from the entire world. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings did not concern themselves with servant girls. By morning, the feast would be forgotten, and she would return to her pots and her silence, exactly as she preferred. But deep in her chest, in the same place where she had buried her voice for years, something had cracked open, and she feared it might not close again. Outside her small window, the castle stood dark and quiet under a sky heavy with stars, unaware that within its ancient walls, an accidental song had just set two impossible lives on a collision course neither of them could stop. By the time the sun rose over Blackmoor, casting pale light across the stone towers and frost-covered courtyards, word had already begun to spread among the kitchen staff and lower servants. Whispers moved quickly through narrow halls and cramped sleeping quarters, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. Some said the king had wept during her song. Others swore he had risen from his throne and nearly crossed the hall to reach her before catching himself. None of it was entirely true, but all of it carried a single undeniable truth at its core. Something had happened last night that the castle had never seen before. Ilara woke before dawn, as she always did, expecting nothing more than another long day of scrubbing pots and hauling water. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back, and made her way to the kitchens, hoping the previous night had already been forgotten by everyone except her. It had not. The moment she stepped through the kitchen doorway, every head turned. Ren, the firewood boy, nearly dropped the bundle in his arms. An older cook named Bess, who had barely spoken 2 words to Ilara in 6 years, actually smiled at her, a rare and startling sight. "There she is," Bess said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The girl who silenced the whole hall." "It was an accident," Ilara said quickly, moving toward her usual station near the wash basins. "Nothing more." "An accident that has half the castle talking," Bess replied, though not unkindly. "You should be careful, girl. That kind of attention does not simply fade away." Ilara wanted to believe otherwise. She wanted to sink back into her familiar routine, the comfort of invisible work, the safety of being overlooked. But as the morning wore on, she noticed something unusual. Guards who normally ignored the kitchen staff entirely now glanced her way whenever she passed. A steward she had never spoken to before nodded at her with something close to respect. Even the head cook, a stern woman who ruled the kitchen with an iron will, seemed to soften slightly whenever Ilara was near. By midday, Garrick himself appeared at the kitchen entrance, his presence causing an immediate hush among the staff. He was not a man who visited the lower halls often, and his sudden appearance sent a ripple of nervous energy through the room. "Ilara Voss," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made everyone straighten. Ilara set down the pot she had been scrubbing, her heart pounding. "Yes, sir. You will come with me." The other servants exchanged glances, some worried, some curious, none quite sure what to expect. Ilara wiped her hands and followed Garrick out of the kitchen, her mind racing through every possible reason she might be summoned. Punishment for stepping onto the platform without permission, questions about where she had learned to sing, something worse, though she could not imagine what. Garrick led her through corridors she had never walked before, past guarded doors and tapestries depicting battles she did not recognize, until they reached a small private chamber near the edge of the castle's upper wing. It was far from the grand throne room, quieter, more personal. "Wait here," Garrick instructed, then disappeared through a heavy wooden door, leaving her alone in the narrow hallway. Ilara's hands trembled as she waited, her mind spinning with possibilities. She thought of running, of slipping back toward the servant quarters, and pretending none of this had happened. But before she could act on the impulse, the door opened again, and Garrick stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The chamber inside was smaller than she expected, sparsely furnished with a simple desk, a few shelves lined with old books, and a single window overlooking the training yards below. And there, standing near the window with his back to her, was King Ronan Ashgard. Ilara froze in the doorway, unsure whether to bow, speak, or remain silent. The king did not turn immediately. He simply stood there, staring out at the courtyard, his broad shoulders tense beneath a dark cloak. "Leave us," Ronan said quietly, and Garrick withdrew, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silence that followed. Ilara remained near the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never been alone with the king before, had never expected to be, and the weight of his presence pressed against her like something physical. Finally, Ronan turned to face her. Up close, his expression was unreadable, neither angry nor warm, simply intense in a way that made her want to look away and yet unable to do so. "Do you know why I summoned you?" he asked. "No, my lord," Elara said honestly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Last night, you sang. I did not mean to cause any disruption, my lord. Corin asked me to fill the silence when the court singer fell ill. I only meant to help." Ronan studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and searching, as though trying to read something written beneath her skin. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Elara hesitated. The question touched a memory she had buried deep, one she rarely allowed herself to revisit. "My mother taught me, my lord, before I came to the castle." "And where is your mother now?" "Gone," Elara said simply, offering nothing further. Something flickered across Ronan's face, a shadow of understanding that surprised her. He did not press for more details, though she sensed he wanted to. Instead, he turned back toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have heard singers from every court in the north," he said. "Trained voices, expensive instruments, performances designed to please kings and impress nobles. None of them ever moved me, not once in my entire life." Elara remained silent, unsure how to respond to such an admission from a man she had believed incapable of feeling anything at all. "Last night," Ronan continued, "you stood on that platform with no training, no preparation, and no reason to believe anyone would listen, and yet the entire hall fell silent because of you." "I do not know why that happened, my lord," Elara said. "I only sang because I had no other choice." Ronan turned to face her again, and for the first time, something almost vulnerable crossed his features, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. "I would like you to sing for me again." Elara blinked, caught off guard. "Now, my lord." "No," Ronan said, shaking his head slightly. "Not as a performance. I want you to teach me." The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Elara wondered if she had misheard. "Teach you, my lord." "To sing," Ronan clarified, though the admission seemed to cost him something, a flicker of discomfort crossing his stern expression. "I have never sung in my life. My father believed such things were beneath a ruler, weaknesses unworthy of a king. I was taught to fight, to command, to conquer. I was never taught to feel anything, let alone express it." Elara stared at him, stunned by the raw honesty in his voice, so different from the cold authority she had witnessed the night before. A king, feared across every northern territory, was standing before her, admitting a vulnerability she doubted he had ever shared with anyone. "My lord, I am only a servant," she said carefully. "I have no formal training. I would not know how to teach a king anything." "I am not asking you as a king," Ronan said, his voice quieter now. "I am asking as a man who heard something last night that he cannot forget and does not wish to." Alara's mind raced, torn between the instinct to refuse and a strange, unexpected curiosity about the man standing before her, so different from the cold figure she had glimpsed across the crowded hall. She thought of Corin's warning, the fear that attention from the king was never simple. She thought of her own carefully guarded silence, the voice she had spent years suppressing. "I will need to think on this, my lord," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Something like surprise flickered across Ronan's face, as though he was unaccustomed to hearing anything other than immediate agreement. But instead of anger, he simply nodded. "Very well," he said. "Return to your duties. But know this, Elara Voss. Whatever decision you make, no harm will come to you because of it." She left the chamber in a daze, Garrick escorting her silently back toward the servant quarters. Her mind spun with everything that had happened, the impossible request, the strange vulnerability she had witnessed in a man the entire kingdom feared. She did not know yet that her answer, whatever it would be, was about to change the course of both their lives forever. That night, as she lay awake once again, staring at the same cracked ceiling above her narrow cot, Elara realized with quiet dread that some part of her had already decided. Morning came gray and cold over Blackmoor, mist curling low across the courtyards as the castle stirred to life. Elara had made her decision sometime before dawn, though it left her stomach in knots. She told herself it was simple gratitude, a debt owed to a king who had promised her safety when he could have simply commanded her obedience instead. She told herself many things that morning, none of which explained the strange flutter in her chest whenever she thought of his voice asking her to teach him. She found Garrick waiting near the kitchen entrance before her shift even began, as though he had known her answer before she spoke it. "The king wishes to know if you have decided," Garrick said, his tone carefully neutral, though his sharp eyes studied her closely. "Tell him yes," Ilara said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. But it must remain private. If the court learns of this, it will only cause trouble for us both. Garrick nodded slowly. He anticipated as much. There is a chamber in the old West Tower, rarely used, far from prying eyes. You will meet him there each evening, after the castle has quieted. And so it began. The first lesson was nothing short of a disaster. Ilara arrived at the West Tower chamber just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her nerves stretched thin. The room was small but comfortable, warmed by a modest fire, its stone walls lined with old tapestries depicting long-forgotten battles. Ronan stood near the window when she entered, still dressed in the dark, practical clothing he wore when not holding court, looking less like a feared ruler and more like an uncertain man bracing for failure. "You came," he said, as though surprised, despite having arranged the entire meeting himself. "I gave my word," Ilara replied, setting down the small loot she had borrowed from the kitchen stores. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, neither quite sure how to begin. Ilara had never taught anyone anything in her life, let alone a king who had spent decades believing emotion itself was a weakness to be crushed rather than expressed. "Perhaps we should start simply," she said finally, gesturing for him to sit near the fire. "Before we speak of singing, you must first learn to breathe properly. Most people breathe from their chest, shallow and quick. Singing requires breath from deeper, from here." She pressed a hand lightly against her own stomach, demonstrating. Ronan frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the exercise, but he lowered himself onto the wooden bench and attempted to mimic her breathing, his broad shoulders rising and falling in stiff, mechanical motions that made Ilara nearly laugh despite herself. "You are thinking too hard about it, my lord," she said. "Singing is not a battle to be won through force. It requires you to let go, not to control." "I do not know how to let go of anything," Ronan admitted quietly, the honesty in his voice catching her off guard. "I have spent my entire life being told that control is the only thing standing between order and chaos." Ilara studied him for a long moment, seeing past the crown and the reputation to the man beneath, someone who had clearly never been allowed to simply exist without purpose or expectation. "Then perhaps that is exactly why you have never sung," she said gently. "Singing does not ask you to control anything. It asks you to feel something and let it out." They worked through simple breathing exercises for nearly an hour, Ronan's frustration mounting each time his voice came out too rigid, too forced, nothing like the natural warmth Ilara possessed without even trying. At one point, after a particularly stiff attempt at a simple scale, he let out a low, frustrated sound and dropped his head into his hands. "This is foolish," he muttered. "A king should not sound like a strangled animal." Despite herself, Ilara laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised them both. Ronan looked up, startled, his expression shifting from frustration to something softer, almost curious. "You laughed," he said. "I apologize, my lord. It was not my place." "No," Ronan said quickly, something unfamiliar flickering across his stern features. "Do not apologize. I cannot remember the last time anyone laughed in my presence without fear behind it." The comment hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. Ilara felt a strange ache in her chest, a flicker of sympathy for a man who held absolute power over an entire kingdom, and yet seemed utterly alone within it. Their lessons continued over the following nights, each one slightly less awkward than the last. Ronan remained stiff and guarded during the early sessions, but slowly, painfully, something within him began to loosen. He asked her questions about the songs she knew, where they came from, what memories they carried. She found herself answering more honestly than she intended, sharing fragments of her childhood, the village she had lost, the mother whose voice she still heard echoing in her own. In turn, Ronan began to share pieces of himself he had clearly never spoken aloud before. He told her of his father, a king who ruled through fear and demanded the same from his son, who beat gentleness out of him before he was old enough to understand what he was losing. He told her of the isolation of leadership, the constant weight of decisions that determined the lives of thousands, the impossible loneliness of a throne that offered power but never companionship. "Do you ever regret it?" Ilara asked one evening, as they sat near the dying fire, the lute resting untouched between them. "Being king, I mean." Ronan considered the question carefully, something he rarely allowed himself to do. "I do not know how to regret something I never chose," he said finally. "I was born into this crown. There was never a version of my life where I existed simply as a man, free to feel whatever I wished without consequence." "And now?" Ilara asked softly. Ronan met her gaze, something raw and unguarded passing between them. "Now I am beginning to wonder what I have missed." The words settled between them like a spark catching dry wood, neither of them quite ready to name what was happening, but both aware that something had shifted, something neither of them could easily undo. As the lessons progressed, Ronan's voice slowly began to improve, not through perfect technique, but through genuine effort, a willingness to be imperfect that Alara suspected he had never allowed himself before. He would never possess her natural gift, but there was something moving in the way he tried, the way his guarded heart cracked open note by note, breath by breath, until one evening, nearly 3 weeks into their secret lessons, he managed to sing a full verse of a simple song, without faltering, his voice rough but genuine, carrying an emotion Alara had not expected to hear from a man so carefully trained to suppress it. When he finished, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire. Alara felt an unexpected sting of emotion rise in her throat, watching the King of Blackmoor, feared across the entire north, look at her with something close to wonder, as though she had given him a gift more valuable than any treasure in his vast kingdom. "That was the first time in my life I have ever done something purely because I wanted to," Ronan said quietly, "not because duty demanded it." Alara did not know how to respond to such a confession, so she simply nodded, her own throat too tight for words. But even as their bond deepened within the privacy of the West Tower chamber, the wider castle had not forgotten the strange events of the feast weeks earlier. Servants whispered about the king's unusual absences each evening, always around the same hour, always disappearing toward the same unused wing of the castle. Guards noted his lighter mood during council meetings, a subtle shift that unsettled advisors accustomed to his cold, unyielding demeanor. Garrick, ever observant, watched his king with growing concern, though he said nothing directly. He had served 3 generations of Ashgard rulers and understood better than most the dangers that came with a king showing vulnerability, especially one whose throne rested on a foundation of feared strength rather than beloved leadership. It was Lady Adelina Thornfield, a noblewoman with ambitions stretching far beyond her current standing, who first noticed the pattern with dangerous clarity. She had spent years positioning her family for greater influence within Blackmoor's court, hoping to secure a marriage alliance between her own bloodline and the king himself. The sudden change in Ronan's behavior, his frequent disappearances, the softness she noticed in his expression during rare public appearances, struck her as both curious and threatening. She began asking careful questions among the castle staff, offering small favors and quiet bribes to loosen tongues. It did not take long before she learned of the servant girl who had sung at the feast, the one whispered about among the kitchen workers, the one who had apparently caught the king's attention in a way no noblewoman ever had. Adelina's initial reaction was amusement, quickly followed by cold calculation. A servant girl posed no true threat to her ambitions. Not directly, not through any legitimate path to power. But if the king's affections were truly drifting toward someone so far beneath his station, it could complicate her carefully laid plans. Plans that had taken years to construct, and involved promises made to powerful allies who expected results. She decided, for now, simply to watch and wait, gathering information before deciding how best to act. Patience, she reminded herself, had always been her greatest weapon. Meanwhile, within the walls of the West Tower, oblivious to the growing danger circling them, Ronan and Alara continued their nightly meetings, each one drawing them closer together in ways neither fully understood nor knew how to stop. What had begun as a simple request to learn a skill had slowly transformed into something far more complicated, a connection built on shared vulnerability, mutual understanding, and an intimacy neither of them had experienced before. One evening, as autumn winds howled outside the tower windows, Ronan reached for the lute himself, something he had never attempted before. His large hands awkward against the delicate strings, Alara guided his fingers gently, showing him where to place them, her touch light and careful. "Like this," she said softly, adjusting his grip. Their eyes met in the firelight, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Ronan's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he caught himself, clearing his throat and looking away, his expression a mixture of confusion and restraint. "I apologize," he said quietly. "That was inappropriate of me." "No," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper, surprising them both with her honesty. "It was not inappropriate. It was simply unexpected." Ronan studied her carefully, searching her face for any sign of discomfort or fear, finding none. "Alara," he said slowly, testing her name in a way he had never done before, softer than any command he had ever given. "I do not know what this is between us. I only know that I have never felt anything like it in my entire life." Alara's heart pounded so loudly she feared he might hear it. "Nor have I, my lord." "Ronan," he corrected gently. "When we are here, in this room, you need not call me anything else." She nodded, unable to find the words to respond, and instead simply reached forward, adjusting his fingers once more against the lute strings, allowing the moment to stretch between them, fragile and uncertain. Neither of them ready to name what was growing, but both increasingly aware that whatever it was, it had already changed them both beyond return. Outside the tower, unnoticed by either of them, a single figure lingered in the shadows of the corridor below, having followed Garrick's careful footsteps earlier that evening out of simple curiosity. The figure, a young guard loyal to Lady Adelina's growing network of informants, watched the flickering candlelight through the narrow window above, noting the unmistakable shapes of two figures sitting close together, their voices too quiet to make out but their closeness impossible to mistake. By morning, word would reach Lady Adelina of exactly what she had suspected, confirmation that the king's heart had indeed strayed toward a servant girl no one had ever considered a threat. And with that confirmation came the first quiet stirrings of a plan designed to end the connection before it could grow any further. A plan that would soon threaten not only Alara's fragile happiness but her very life within the walls of Blackmore Castle. Lady Adelina Thornfield did not act rashly. She had learned long ago that hasty moves led to failure, while patience, properly applied, could dismantle even the strongest defenses. She spent the following days gathering more information, using her network of servants and minor nobles to piece together the full picture of what was happening between the king and the kitchen girl. She discovered that the meetings happened every evening without fail, always in the abandoned West Tower, always after the castle had settled into quiet. She learned that Garrick himself escorted Alara there, suggesting the king's most trusted advisor was complicit in keeping the affair hidden. Most troubling of all, she learned from a maid who cleaned the tower chamber each morning that the fire was always freshly stoked, the wooden bench always positioned close together, and once, discarded near the hearth, a single ribbon that matched the ones worn by kitchen servants. Adelina brought her findings to her uncle, Duke Alden Thornfield, a powerful nobleman whose influence within the council rivaled even Garrick's standing with the king. Alden had long supported the idea of Adelina marrying Ronan, believing such a union would secure his family's position for generations. News of a servant girl capturing the king's private attention threatened everything he had worked toward. "This cannot continue," Alden said, pacing the length of his private study, his expression dark with calculation. "If the council learns the king has been secretly meeting with a servant, entertaining thoughts of affection towards someone so far beneath his station, it will weaken his authority. Other pack leaders will question his judgment. Rivals will see weakness where they once saw strength." "What do you propose we do?" Adelina asked, settling into a chair near the fire, her expression carefully composed, despite the satisfaction simmering beneath her calm exterior. "For now, nothing drastic," Alden said. "We watch, we wait, and we prepare. If necessary, we will find a way to remove the girl from the picture entirely, quietly, without drawing attention to ourselves, or risking the king's anger." Adelina nodded slowly, already turning possibilities over in her mind. She had connections throughout the castle, servants who owed her favors, guards who valued coin over loyalty. If the situation required more forceful action eventually, she had the means to arrange it discreetly. Meanwhile, within the council chambers, pressure began mounting on Ronan from an entirely different direction. Several allied pack leaders, having heard rumors of instability along Blackmore's southern borders, began pushing for a strategic marriage alliance to strengthen the kingdom's political standing. Duke Alden, seizing the opportunity, championed his niece as the ideal candidate, praising her lineage, her connections, and her suitability as a future queen. Ronan found himself trapped in council sessions that stretched for hours, advisors debating the merits of various political marriages, as though he were a piece on a strategy board, rather than a man with his own desires. He listened with growing frustration, his mind repeatedly drifting toward the quiet chamber in the West Tower, where, for the first time in his life, he felt something resembling genuine happiness. The southern borders remain vulnerable, Garrick reminded him privately after one particularly tense council session. A marriage alliance with House Thornfield would secure additional forces and resources, strengthening our position considerably. "I am aware of the political benefits," Ronan said, his jaw tight with restrained frustration. "I do not require reminding." Garrick studied his king carefully, choosing his next words with unusual caution. "My lord, I have served your family for many years. I have watched you carry burdens no man should bear alone, and I have never once seen you smile the way you have these past weeks. Whatever is happening between you and the girl, it has changed you, and not for the worse." Ronan looked up sharply, surprised by his advisor's uncharacteristic candor. "You disapprove?" "I did not say that," Garrick replied carefully. "But you must understand the danger. A king's heart is never entirely his own. Others will always seek to use it, twist it, or destroy it if it threatens their ambitions. If your feelings for this girl become widely known, she will become a target, whether you intend it or not. The warning settled heavily in Ronan's chest, confirming fears he had tried to ignore since their lessons began. He knew the political landscape of his court well enough to understand the dangers Garrick described, yet knowing the danger did nothing to diminish the pull he felt toward Alara each evening. The way her presence had become the single source of genuine warmth in an otherwise cold and calculated existence. That evening, as he made his way toward the West Tower, his mind heavy with the weight of council pressures and unspoken threats, Ronan found Alara already waiting, her expression brightening the moment she saw him despite the exhaustion evident in his features. "You seem troubled tonight," she observed, setting aside the lute she had been tuning. "The council grows insistent on matters of marriage," Ronan admitted, the words feeling strange and heavy leaving his mouth. He had never discussed such matters with anyone outside his closest advisors, yet something about Alara's presence made honesty feel natural rather than dangerous. Alara's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her features before she carefully composed herself. "A king must consider such things," she said quietly. "For the good of his kingdom." "Is that truly what you believe I should do?" Ronan asked, watching her closely. "It does not matter what I believe," Alara replied, though her voice carried an edge of something that suggested otherwise. "I am only a servant. My opinions on such matters hold no weight." "They hold weight with me," Ronan said firmly, closing the distance between them until he stood directly before her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Alara, these past weeks have shown me more about myself than my entire life before them. I do not wish to lose this, whatever it is between us, for the sake of political convenience." Alara's breath caught, torn between hope and fear, aware of exactly how dangerous such feelings could become for someone in her position. "Ronan," she said softly, using his name as he had once invited her to, "you are a king. Whatever happens between us within these walls cannot exist beyond them. The world will not allow it. Then perhaps the world must learn to accept what it does not expect," Ronan said, his voice low and determined, though even he heard the uncertainty beneath his own words. They stood close together in the firelight, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging heavy between them, neither quite ready to name the depth of what had grown from simple singing lessons into something far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Neither of them noticed, in that private moment, the shadow that lingered briefly outside the tower window before disappearing into the darkness beyond, carrying word of what had been witnessed back toward Lady Adelina's waiting ears. Over the following days, the pressure from the council only intensified. Duke Alden pushed harder for a formal announcement of engagement between Ronan and Adelina, citing urgent political necessity and the growing instability along the southern territories. Rival pack leaders, sensing opportunity in any sign of division within Blackmore's leadership, began making subtle threats disguised as diplomatic inquiries, testing whether Ronan's authority remained as solid as it once had been. Ronan found himself caught between two increasingly incompatible worlds, the cold political reality of his throne and the fragile, precious connection growing within the walls of the West Tower. He knew he could not indefinitely avoid the council's demands, yet the thought of formally binding himself to Adelina, a woman he felt nothing toward beyond polite indifference, filled him with a dread he had never experienced before discovering what genuine connection actually felt like. Alara, meanwhile, struggled with her own fears, aware that whatever existed between them could never survive the realities of court politics and noble expectations. She had spent her entire life learning to remain invisible, to avoid drawing attention that might lead to danger or disappointment. Yet here she was, entangled with the most powerful man in the kingdom, fully aware that such entanglement could only end in heartbreak, or worse. One evening, as their lesson drew to a close, Alara finally voiced the fear that had been growing within her for days. "Ronan," she said carefully, watching his expression closely, "what happens when the council forces your hand, when they demand you marry Lady Adelina for the sake of the kingdom?" Ronan's jaw tightened, the question striking at exactly the uncertainty he had been avoiding. "I do not yet know," he admitted honestly, "but I promise you this, Alara. Whatever decision I make, it will not be made without considering what exists between us." It was not the reassurance she had hoped for, but it was honest, and in that honesty, Alara found a fragile thread of hope to hold on to, even as the shadows of political ambition and jealous scheming continued gathering around them both, unseen and unacknowledged, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The blow fell faster than anyone expected. It began with a missing bracelet, a delicate piece of jewelry belonging to Lady Adelina, crafted from silver and set with a single sapphire, a family heirloom she claimed had been stolen from her private chambers. When guards searched the servant quarters under Duke Alden's direct orders, citing suspicion of theft among the kitchen staff, the bracelet was found hidden beneath Alara's thin mattress, wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth as though deliberately concealed. Alara had never seen the bracelet before in her life. She was seized without warning, dragged from her sleeping quarters in the gray hours before dawn by 2 guards who refused to answer her frantic questions. Ren, watching from the shadows of the servant hall, ran immediately toward the kitchens to find Bess, his young face pale with fear. "They took her," he gasped. "They said she stole from Lady Adelina. They are taking her to the dungeons." Bess's expression hardened with disbelief. "That girl has never stolen so much as a crumb in 6 years. Something is wrong here." News of Alara's arrest spread through the castle with startling speed, reaching Garrick within the hour. He immediately suspected foul play, understanding instantly that such a conveniently timed accusation could not be coincidence. He rushed to inform Ronan before council members could use the situation to their advantage. Ronan received the news in his private chambers, and the fury that overtook him was unlike anything Garrick had witnessed in all his years of service. The king's control, always so carefully maintained, cracked entirely as he demanded immediate answers. "On whose authority was she arrested?" Ronan demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Duke Alden's, my lord," Garrick replied carefully. "Acting on Lady Adelina's accusation of theft. The evidence was found in her quarters, though I confess the timing troubles me greatly." "Where is she now?" "The dungeons, my lord, awaiting formal judgment before the council." Ronan moved with a speed that startled even his own guards, striding through the castle corridors with such barely restrained fury that servants scattered from his path without needing to be told twice. He descended into the cold stone dungeons beneath the castle, guards stepping aside instinctively as he approached the cell where Alara sat huddled against the damp stone wall, her wrists bound, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. The moment she saw him, relief flooded her features, quickly followed by dread, as she realized the complicated danger his presence there represented. "Ronan," she whispered, "you should not be here. It will only make things worse." "I do not care what appearances suggest," Ronan said firmly, gesturing for the guard to unlock the cell immediately. "Tell me exactly what happened." Alara explained everything, her voice trembling with confusion and fear, describing how she had woken to guards tearing through her belongings, how the bracelet had appeared in her possession without any explanation she could offer. Ronan listened carefully, his fury building with each detail, certain beyond doubt that the entire situation had been carefully orchestrated. "This is Adelina's doing," he said grimly, "or her uncle's, perhaps both." "You cannot simply release me without proper judgment," Alara said, even as hope flickered in her chest at his obvious determination to protect her. "The council will see it as favoritism, proof of exactly what they fear." "Let them see whatever they wish," Ronan said, his jaw set with unwavering resolve. "I will not allow an innocent woman to suffer for crimes she did not commit, regardless of what political convenience demands." He ordered her released immediately, ignoring the guards' hesitant glances toward each other, aware that such an action would likely reach the council within minutes. True to his expectation, by the time he escorted Alara from the dungeons personally, word had already spread that the king himself had intervened to free the accused servant girl, sparking exactly the kind of scandal Duke Alden and Lady Adelina had been hoping to provoke. An emergency council session was called before midday, nobles and pack leaders gathering with barely concealed excitement at the prospect of witnessing the king's judgment questioned openly for the first time in his reign. Duke Alden stood before the assembled council, his expression carefully arranged into concerned disapproval. "My lord," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I understand your desire for mercy, but releasing an accused thief without proper judgment sets a dangerous precedent. It suggests favoritism unbecoming of a ruler sworn to uphold justice equally among all his subjects." "The evidence against her was fabricated," Ronan said coldly, standing before the council with unshakable authority despite the tension crackling through the room. "I have reason to believe this entire situation was orchestrated to discredit her, and, by extension, myself." Murmurs rippled through the gathered nobles at such a direct accusation, though none dared voice open disagreement with their king. Lady Adelina, seated near her uncle, maintained a carefully composed expression of wounded innocence, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation as she watched the scene unfold. "My lord," she said softly, rising gracefully to address the council directly, "I understand your protectiveness toward the girl." Her voice moved many hearts at the feast, including, it seems, your own. But surely you cannot allow personal feelings to override justice within your own court. The comment landed exactly as intended, forcing whispers of confirmation through the chamber, the open acknowledgement of what many had already suspected. Ronan's expression darkened, aware that Adelina had just publicly cornered him into either denying feelings he could not honestly deny, or admitting a vulnerability that would weaken his standing before the entire council. Alara, standing quietly near the chamber entrance where Garrick had positioned her, felt her heart pound with dread, watching the political battlefield unfold around her, aware that her fate now hung precariously between forces far more powerful than herself. "I will not pretend to virtues I do not possess," Ronan said finally, his voice carrying through the silent chamber with unshakable conviction. "Yes, I hold genuine regard for Alara Voss, but my decision to release her from unjust imprisonment stems from evidence, not affection alone." The bracelet in question was never reported missing until immediately after her singing drew unexpected attention at the feast. "I find that timing far too convenient to ignore." Duke Alden's composed expression flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty crossing his features before he recovered. "Are you suggesting deliberate deception, my lord? Such an accusation against my niece is exceedingly serious." "I am suggesting," Ronan said, his voice growing colder and more commanding with each word, "that this council conduct a proper investigation into how that bracelet came to be hidden within a servant's quarters, rather than accepting convenient assumptions without question." The chamber fell into tense silence, nobles exchanging uncertain glances, unsure how to navigate a confrontation between their king and one of the court's most influential families. Garrick stepped forward carefully, offering a measured suggestion that allowed both sides a path forward without immediate escalation. "Perhaps," he suggested diplomatically, "a formal investigation, conducted by neutral parties, would serve everyone's interests best. If Alara Voss is proven innocent, as the king suspects, the true culprit behind this deception can be properly identified and punished according to law." The suggestion, though reasonable, satisfied no one entirely. Duke Alden reluctantly agreed, unable to refuse without appearing to obstruct justice, while privately calculating how to ensure any investigation concluded in his family's favor. Lady Adelina maintained her composed expression, though the flicker of frustration in her eyes did not escape Ronan's notice. As the council session ended, and nobles dispersed with hushed whispers filling the corridors, Ronan found himself facing a court now fully aware of his feelings toward a servant girl, a vulnerability he could no longer hide or deny. The political consequences would likely prove severe, yet as he watched Alara standing quietly near the chamber entrance, relief and fear mingling in her expression, he found he regretted nothing about defending her, regardless of the cost. That evening, within the privacy of the West Tower, the weight of everything that had happened finally settled between them. "I never wished to become the source of your troubles," Alara said quietly, her voice heavy with guilt. "Perhaps it would be simpler if I left the castle entirely, before more harm comes to either of us." "Do not speak such things," Ronan said firmly, closing the distance between them with sudden intensity. "I have spent my entire life following expectations placed upon me by others, sacrificing every genuine desire for the sake of duty and appearance. I will not sacrifice this, Alara, not without a fight." "They will not stop," Alara warned, fear evident beneath her carefully maintained composure. "Adelina and her uncle have too much invested in seeing you married into their family. Today's failure will only make them more determined, more dangerous." Ronan's jaw tightened with grim acknowledgement of the truth in her words. "Then we will face whatever comes together," he said, rather than allowing fear to separate us before they even strike again. Neither of them could have anticipated exactly how soon, or how dangerously, that next strike would come. 3 nights after the council session, Alara was summoned unexpectedly to the lower storage cellars, told by a young servant she barely recognized that Bess required her help sorting through spoiled grain stores before morning. Something about the request felt wrong from the start, an odd urgency in the messenger's voice, an unfamiliar coldness in her eyes, but Alara pushed aside her unease, reminding herself that fear had begun coloring every corner of her life since the false accusation. She should have trusted her instincts. The cellar was empty when she arrived, torches burned low, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp stone. She had barely taken 3 steps inside when a rough hand clamped over her mouth from behind, muffling her scream before it could escape. Strong arms dragged her backward into the shadows as she thrashed against her attacker, her heart pounding with pure terror. "Quiet, girl," a low voice growled near her ear, "or this ends far worse for you." 2 more figures emerged from the darkness, their faces partially hidden beneath dark hoods, though Alara recognized one of them immediately as a guard who had stood watch during her earlier imprisonment. A man she now understood had always been loyal to coin rather than justice. They bound her wrists tightly, gagging her before she could cry out again, and began dragging her toward a hidden passage she had never known existed within the castle's ancient foundations. Her mind raced with panic, understanding immediately that this was no random attack. Someone had planned this carefully, someone with enough influence to arrange her disappearance without immediate suspicion. She thought of Ronan, of the danger her absence would soon reveal, praying desperately that someone would notice before it became too late. She was thrown into a narrow storage room deep beneath the castle, the door sealed from outside, leaving her alone in near total darkness, with only her racing thoughts for company. She worked frantically at the ropes binding her wrists, ignoring the pain as rough fibers cut into her skin, determined not to simply wait helplessly for whatever fate her captors intended. Above ground, within the West Tower, Ronan waited with growing unease as the hour of their scheduled lesson passed, without any sign of Alara's arrival. She had never once been late in all their weeks together, and a cold dread began settling in his chest as the minutes stretched into an hour, then longer. He summoned Garrick immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "Find her, now." Garrick moved swiftly, questioning kitchen staff and servants throughout the lower halls, quickly discovering that Alara had been sent to the storage cellars on an errand no one else could confirm having actually requested. Bess, confused and increasingly worried, insisted she had never sent for Alara that evening at all. "Someone lied to bring her there," Garrick reported grimly upon returning to Ronan, "and now she has vanished entirely." Ronan's fury ignited instantly, cold and absolute, the careful control he had maintained his entire life shattering completely at the realization that Alara had been taken, likely by the very people who had already tried once to destroy her through false accusation. "Search every corridor, every hidden passage within this castle," Ronan commanded, his voice carrying an authority that sent guards scrambling immediately into action. "I want this castle turned inside out until she is found." The search stretched through the night, guards combing through forgotten corridors and sealed chambers throughout Blackmoor's ancient structure. Ronan himself led a portion of the search, refusing to remain idle, while Alara's fate remained uncertain, his mind tormented by every possible horror that might be befalling her. It was Wren, the young firewood boy who had grown fond of Alara during her time in the kitchens, who finally provided the crucial clue. He had noticed, days earlier, unusual activity near an old storage cellar rarely used since a section of it had partially collapsed decades before, guards passing through at odd hours, when no legitimate business required their presence there. Ronan and Garrick moved swiftly toward the location Wren described, joined by a small contingent of trusted guards. They found the sealed passage exactly where the boy indicated, hidden behind stacked crates that had clearly been moved recently, disturbed dust marking a path that others had failed to notice. Inside the narrow room beyond, they found Alara exactly where her captors had left her, her wrists raw from working desperately at her bindings, exhaustion and fear evident in every line of her body, yet unmistakably alive. The relief that flooded through Ronan upon seeing her was so overwhelming it nearly brought him to his knees. He rushed forward, cutting through the remaining ropes with his own blade, pulling her into his arms the moment she was free. "I feared the worst," he said, his voice rough with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "I should never have allowed you to be in danger because of my own selfish desires." "This was not your doing," Alara said, though her voice trembled with exhaustion and lingering fear. "Someone wanted me gone permanently, Ronan. This was no simple warning." Their attention turned immediately toward uncovering exactly who had orchestrated her kidnapping. Under careful questioning, one of the guards involved, faced with the certainty of severe punishment, finally confessed the truth, revealing that Lady Adelina herself had arranged the entire scheme, paying generously for Alara's permanent disappearance from the castle, intending to make it appear as though she had simply fled following the earlier scandal of her false imprisonment. Armed with this confession, Ronan called for an immediate and public confrontation, refusing to allow the matter to be quietly buried through political maneuvering as Duke Alden would certainly attempt. He summoned the entire council, along with Lady Adelina and her uncle, demanding answers before the full weight of Blackmoor's assembled nobility. The confrontation that followed shook the foundations of the court entirely. Faced with undeniable evidence and a guard's sworn confession, Lady Adelina's careful composure finally crumbled beneath the pressure of her exposed scheme. Duke Alden attempted desperately to distance himself from his niece's actions, though few among the council believed his claims of complete ignorance regarding her methods. "You endangered an innocent woman's life for the sake of political ambition," Ronan said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber with cold, absolute authority. the full weight of his position as ruler evident in every measured word. Such actions cannot go unpunished, regardless of noble standing or family influence. Lady Adelina was stripped of her position within the court and exiled from Blackmore's territories entirely, her family's influence severely diminished by the scandal that followed. Duke Alden, though avoiding direct punishment through lack of concrete evidence against himself personally, found his standing within the council permanently weakened, his ambitions for greater power effectively crushed by his niece's exposed treachery. In the aftermath of the confrontation, as the council chamber slowly emptied and whispers of the scandal spread throughout the castle and beyond, Ronan turned to face the gathered nobles one final time, his expression resolute and unashamed. "I understand that my feelings toward Alara Voss have caused considerable disruption within this court," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "But I will no longer hide or apologize for something that has brought genuine meaning into my life for the first time. Whatever consequences follow, I choose honesty over convenient silence." The declaration, bold and unprecedented for a ruler who had always maintained careful distance from his own emotions, settled over the chamber like a change in weather, some nobles exchanging uncertain glances, others nodding with quiet respect for a king finally showing the humanity his position had so long denied him. In the weeks that followed, as the scandal gradually settled and the court adjusted to the reality of their king's genuine affection for a woman far outside traditional expectations, Blackmore itself seemed to shift subtly beneath the surface. Servants noticed a warmth in Ronan's leadership previously absent, a willingness to listen rather than simply command, a patience with mistakes that had never existed before Alara's voice first silenced that fateful feast. Alara, meanwhile, found herself gradually accepted within circles that had once seemed impossibly distant, though not without lingering resistance from those who still valued tradition over genuine connection. She continued teaching Ronan privately, their lessons no longer secret but still cherished as a space entirely their own, away from the pressures and politics of ruling an entire kingdom. Nearly a year after that unexpected night when her voice first silenced an entire feast, Blackmore gathered once again within its great hall, though this time for an entirely different celebration. Ronan stood before his assembled court, no longer the cold and unreachable king he had once been, but a ruler tempered by genuine feeling, strengthened rather than weakened by his willingness to embrace vulnerability. Beside him stood Alara, no longer a hidden servant but acknowledged openly before the entire kingdom, her simple dignity earning quiet respect even among nobles who had once dismissed her entirely. When the ceremony binding them together as partners for life concluded, and the hall erupted into genuine celebration, rather than the hollow toasts of that first fateful feast, Ronan turned to Alara, with an expression of open joy few in the kingdom had ever witnessed upon their king's face. "Sing for me," he said softly, echoing the request that had changed both their lives forever. And so she did, her voice rising once again through Blackmore's ancient halls, no longer trembling with fear or uncertainty, but full and confident, carrying not grief this time, but genuine happiness. The entire hall fell silent once more, just as it had that very first night, though this time the silence carried none of the shock or disbelief of before, only quiet wonder at witnessing a kingdom transformed by the simple, unexpected power of a single voice, and the king who had finally learned to listen. Blackmore would remember that feast for generations, not merely as the night a servant girl's song silenced a room, but as the beginning of a new era, one where strength and gentleness finally learned to coexist within the same crown, and where a king once incapable of feeling anything at all discovered, through patience and courage, exactly what it meant to be truly, fully alive.